Albert Edward Burrows was born in 1871 in Manchester, Lancashire. He was a man with a violent nature and was considered a career criminal. His criminal record included theft, horse stealing, cruelty to animals, assault, as well as appalling acts of violence against both young boys and girls. Over the years he worked as a labourer, which didn't pay well, and eventually in 1914 he married and moved to Glossop, a market town in Derbyshire. He resided in a terraced house with his wife, Clementine, and daughter Ellen. When World War I broke out in 1914, munitions factories offered high wages to workers. Burrows, hearing of this, managed to secure a job at an ammunitions factory in Northwich and appeared to be thriving. However, his penchant for women led him to meet 27-year-old Hannah Calladine in 1917 while working in Northwich. Although she was much younger than him, they started a relationship. Burrows had told her he was a widower with a young child that lived with a housekeeper in Glossop while he stayed in lodging in Northwich. Hannah also had a 4-year-old little girl called Elsie Lodge from a previous relationship. Their relationship endured, resulting in Hannah giving birth to their son in 1918, and they named him Albert Edward Burrows after his father. On May the 27th of that year, Albert married Hannah in a bigamous ceremony. When the war came to an end, the work began to dry up, and Burrows found himself struggling to find work, leaving him unable to provide for both his families. Now both families were struggling to live. He had to provide for Hannah at her parents' home and his wife back in Glossop. The two women apparently knew nothing of each other's existence, although Hannah did know about his daughter. Times were hard, and it was around this time Hannah began to wonder why Albert always seemed short of money, and also found herself inexplicably doubting their marriage. Consequently, she opted to reach out to his daughter, and eventually she learnt the truth. One of the two wives, in a fit of rage, reported the situation to the police, and Burrows received a 6-month prison sentence at Walton Prison and was made to pay maintenance for his child. On leaving prison, Burrows went back to his wife Clementine and daughter in Gloucester. Surprisingly, she took him back. On hearing of his release and his return to his wife, Hannah demanded he pay towards a child they had together, and an affiliation order was given for him to pay. Burrows, not having any money coming in at all, couldn't pay, and his arrears built up. Hannah, still angry that their child wasn't being acknowledged by Burrows, had a committal order put on him, otherwise known as contempt of court, and this sent Burrows to Shrewsbury Prison for 21 days. Burrows found himself in a difficult situation, lacking money and employment. Both women in his life had the power to send him back to prison if he failed to make his child support payments. But he had a plan, and that was probably thought out in prison. Burrows invited Anna and the child to move into the Glossop home. Anna accepted the invitation and moved in on December the 19th, just weeks after he was released from prison. His wife, Clementine, disgusted by his actions, decided to leave, taking their daughter with her. For 3 weeks, Hannah and Burrows lived as man and wife, and his wife sued him, and his debts mounted. When it was time for his court appearance, he informed the court that his mistress had left, taking the children with her. He explained to his wife, Clementine, that Hannah had secured a good job at Seymour Means, which was a bacon shop in Manchester, and that the children were being cared for by a childminder. It would later be revealed that he hadn't informed Hannah's concerned family, who hadn't heard from her for quite some time, that she'd gone on holiday with the children. He continued to correspond with Hannah's family through letters, assuring them that everything was fine. In an attempt to address another issue, he even pretended to be Hannah in his writing. He would go on to tell them Hannah had left him to live with a Chinese man in Liverpool, and she had given the children away. Now, Burrows' wife, what can I say? She resisted going back for a few days, but gave in and moved back in with her husband. It had seemed odd to some people that Hannah and the children had gone when she seemed determined to be involved in Burrows' life. On Sunday the 4th of March, a young boy, little Tommy Wood, went missing that morning. He lived across the road from the Burrows house and often went out in the morning to see his grandmother, who lived just a few doors away. When he didn't return straight away, his parents didn't worry, as he often stayed for dinner with his gran. But it was getting late, and his mother decided to go and bring him home. But he wasn't there, and hadn't been there all day. They searched the usual places, but he had simply vanished. A huge search ensued. Neighbours and the police searched the areas where he had allegedly last been seen. Burrows gave a statement that day that he'd seen the boy with some older boys, stating that Tommy had a whip with him, and gave a description of the item. On Tuesday the 6th, the police thought it was possible the little boy had fallen into the river after heavy rains had caused the river to rise high and run fast. Tommy could have easily been swept away. Bloodhounds were brought in. They followed a scent for a while, but it came to nothing. The Turnley and Glossop brooks were dragged and searched, and a whip was found tied around a small rock in the Bridgefield River, which was odd, Inspector Chadwick thought. On Wednesday, March the 7th, Inspector John Chadwick questioned Burrows again, and he seemed to give a statement voluntarily to the inspector. The statement mentioned that the lad had been seen by Burrows near the bottom of the road with two older boys. Burrows had asked Tommy to come home with him, but he had refused. Inspector Chadwick was sceptical of Burrows. Something didn't seem quite right to him. He sent another search party out. After talking to neighbours, they discovered that Burrows had borrowed some waders from one of them. Inspector Chadwick gathered as much information as he could from witnesses and neighbours of the family and Burrows. Some verified that Burrows had been up Hargate Hill to ask a farmer about a job and had spoken to a policeman and a woman on a lane, and it was around 1:30 he claimed to have seen Tommy with the older boys. He also mentioned he'd spoken to a man called Thomas Shortland about the older boys, and Shortland verified it. Eventually, on March the 9th, a woman told the police she had seen a man and a boy climbing over the coal shield near the coal pit house. On Sunday, March the 4th, around 11:30 a.m, a man had also seen Burrows walking along the road with a young boy. It had been established that Burrows had been seen an hour later at Hargate Hill on his own. The police tried to determine which way Burrows would have gone with the boy in that hour. This led them down some footpaths to the areas where old pit airshafts stood. One was the lower Simonley pit airshaft to the south of High Lane, and the other was the north of High Lane. Both airshafts were in bad condition, since the pits had been closed. Monday the 12th, Burrows was brought in again. This time they put the whip purposely on display. When he asked where they had found it, he was told it was found exactly where he had intended them to find it. Burrows claimed he was just out walking with the boy and had lost him on the moors. He had then changed the story, saying he had at one point told the lad to hide in a hole while he caught a rabbit. He claimed that when he returned to the place he'd left the boy, he had gone, so he just went home. He was told to take them to the place he took the boy after taking him at 11:30. Burrows, feeling nervous, escorted Chadwick to the spot where he said he had last sighted the boy. This location was near the airshaft on the elevated section of the lane. He insisted that he had not crossed over to where the lower shaft was located. The airshaft itself was in a dilapidated condition, heavily concealed by overgrowth. That same afternoon they began to investigate the airshaft with a 3-pronged grappling iron. They lowered it 135 feet to the bottom. It caught something heavy while slowly heaving the heavy object up. The rope broke. It was all they could do for the day, so it was arranged they would go back first thing in the morning. Burrows had watched nervously as the police and volunteers gathered to discuss what to do. He seemed to relax a little as they all made up their mind to go back to town. The next morning word had spread, and suspicion had grown towards Burrows. A group of onlookers, mostly men keen to help, had gathered at the top of the shaft. More and more people had arrived at Simondley village, some just to look and some wanting to help. Tommy Wood had now been missing for over a week. But overnight, plans changed. The police had a feeling that Burrows was trying to distract them from the other airshaft, the lower one. Another reason being that it wouldn't make much difference. They could check them both, as they were only 162 yards apart. And with the heavy equipment they needed, it would be easier to check the lower shaft first. As word had spread regarding the missing child, and the police were now going to search the pit shafts, the newspapers and other onlookers invaded the village, but it would be the villagers that helped with all that was needed for the investigation. The Glossopians used all the resources they had to help. The colliery deputy drew up the plans of the airshaft to help the police. The quarry owners, Tom and Ned Greenwood, knew the area where all the airshafts were and went with any equipment that would be needed, which was a tripod, winch, pulsometer and strong rope. The Glossop Gas Company also provided the labour that was needed for the pulsometer. The local mason provided the block and pulley. As the plans had been changed, there was confusion in the village, as onlookers didn't know where the police were going, and Burrows was now looking very guilty indeed, as he shook when he heard they had changed their mind and gone looking at the other shaft. He took off and found a position to watch as they started to investigate the lower airshaft, but the police knew exactly where he was. I described the finding of little Tommy in Inspector Chadwick's own words. Planks were placed in position across the top of the walls surrounding the circular mouth of the shaft. From these planks, 2 men, a policeman and a person assisting, lowered a rope to the end of which was attached a grappling iron. In a short time it connected, and as a heavy object was being carefully drawn up, there was suddenly a loud splash. Something had fallen from the grappling hook, but as the rope was still weighted, it was drawn to the top. When it was found that a large basket in fairly good condition had been unearthed, it contained only stones, tins and refuse. The grappling iron was once again lowered, and after a time it again connected. Again it was carefully drawn upwards, and as it neared the top, it was seen that the hook was attached to the trousers of a small boy. After a little delay, the lifeless body of the boy was brought to view and detached from the hook. He was immediately identified as Thomas Wood. Officers and some male villagers chased after Burrows. They spread out to cover more ground. After about 1.25 miles, 1 man caught Burrows, hiding in a hole covered by a bush. They grabbed him and tied his hands behind his back as he cried for mercy. They dragged him down the hill and handed him over to the police. He was transported to the Glossop police station, where he cried out, "If my hands were free, there is not a man among you who could face them. I shall not be like Charlie Peace. I shall not tremble when I get to the scaffold." Inside the Glossop police station, Burrows wouldn't or couldn't calm down. To try and ease the situation, Inspector Chadwick tried to have a simple conversation with him. During the conversation, Chadwick inquired about Hannah Calladine and the children, asking if Burrows had any updates on their well-being. In response, Burrows appeared agitated, his eyes showing signs of distress as he spoke erratically, mentioning previous discussions with the Calladines and delving seemingly into nonsensical topics. One thing the inspector did pick up on during Burrows' rant: he claimed Hannah had been with him on the moors when Tommy had gone missing, and it's because of her it happened. Hannah and her children had been missing for a very long time by now, but it had been believed she had left him for another man. Inspector Chadwick began to suspect something awful might have happened to Hannah and her children, so began to investigate and learned that Hannah hadn't been seen since she had walked down Hollincross Road with Burrows and the baby at 6 p.m. on Sunday the 11th of January 1920, the day before he had gone to court and told his wife she had left him. Burrows was last seen going back to his home alone sometime between 11 and 1 a.m. that same day. The next morning he was seen taking 6-year-old Elsie up the same road, telling a woman he met that he was taking her to her mother. He was back within the hour before taking off for court. While these investigations continued, Burrows was held in Strangeways Prison, charged with the murder of Thomas Wood. The details of his death were heartbreaking and monstrous. The inquest read that the boy had been drowned after a vicious estual attack and thrown down a 100-foot drop. The investigation lasted 8 weeks, during which the pit shaft and surrounding fields were significantly damaged by visitors to the site. Burrows concocted a story regarding Hannah and the children, claiming she had been meeting him secretly at the top shaft on the 4th and had met him while Tommy was with him. He claimed the children were playing when Tommy fell down a hole, meaning the top shaft. What he failed to realise was that the 2 airshafts did not connect. He claimed that the water flowing underneath the shaft had pulled Tommy down to the lower shaft. However, this was impossible because the shafts were not connected. They belonged to different pits. On the 7th of May 1923, the search began for Hannah and the children at the lower shaft. It started with gallons of water being pumped out of the shaft while the weather was stable. Constable Rowe, dressed in waders, was lowered down to start moving the stones that had been thrown down over the last weeks. But then the weather changed and the rain and snow hit the village, making it difficult to continue. It went on for a week, but the pumps kept going and the men carried on regardless. The ground around the top started to soften, making it more dangerous, but they didn't stop. It was bitterly cold while the team stood at the top, but Constable Sam Rowe was lowered into the ground and pulled back out time and time again. Day after day, debris was dug out and it seemed hopeless. If there was something to find at the bottom, they needed to find it before Burrows' court case regarding Tommy started in July. The 16th of May was a difficult day. The rain and snow came down heavily. It was 11 p.m. and 5 men were still working on repairing the pulsometer, so the next day's work could start straight away. They decided to call it quits for the night, and Tom Greenwood and Sam Rowe were being hauled up. The ground was muddy and the undergrowth soft. Suddenly the tripod slipped and keeled over, with one of the legs resting on the planks and the top of the tripod rested at the wall surrounding the hole. Greenwood and Rowe were left dangling 30 feet from the ground, while stones and rocks fell, hitting them as they nervously swung around 70 feet from the top. At the top, one man threw himself against the wall to prevent it crumbling, while the two others grabbed the winch handles to ensure the tripod did not collapse and fall. They couldn't move. If they did, the whole lot would cave in. They called out for help, but they were too far away for anyone to hear them. Luckily, 2 cyclists were passing and heard the men shout. They helped pass some strong rope down the hole, and one by one they pulled Greenwood and Rowe up. By the 21st the weather had turned for the better, and the water had receded, revealing older debris. 2 days later, a large box of wood and sacking was pulled up amongst the rubble. What was first thought to be a chalky white object turned out to be human flesh with material sticking to it. In the same box, they discovered a child's skull. Other boxes were brought up that contained more bones, with some flesh still remaining on them. There was also more clothing. The weather once again changed, and on the 31st of May they continued to work. A woman's skull was discovered, and other bones were discovered, including bones belonging to a young female. A child's clogs, boots and clothing were recovered. This continued for 3 more days, while a professor of anatomy from Manchester was brought in to help construct the bones. They found the full remains of a young woman and 2 children. The work at the airshaft was stopped, as they believed they had enough evidence. Hannah's body was formally ID'd by her skull. She had had a deformity to her mouth on the right side, which stopped her from closing her mouth fully. The children were identified by the clothing Hannah's sister had made for them herself. There was no doubt in anyone's mind who they were and who had done this terrible crime. Burrows was tried for murder at Derbyshire Assizes on the 4th of July 1923. He had taken 4 lives, 3 of them being very young children. He had committed horrifying acts against one of them before his life was brutally taken, and walked amongst the people who grieved the loss of that child. He had no concern for his own child or the child he had taken on as his own. He showed no respect for his wife and daughter, and not once showed any remorse for his actions. The prosecution decided to proceed against him for the murders of Anna and her baby Albert. The defence went with Anna having taken her own life, along with her child, by jumping down the pit airshaft voluntarily, which seemed preposterous as she had left her young daughter behind. The trial lasted 2 days, and the jury took only 13 minutes to reach a guilty verdict. He was transferred to Pentonville Prison, and an appeal was rejected. By August, he was placed at Bagthorpe Prison, and on the morning of the 8th of August, he was hanged and sent straight to hell, where he belongs. Thank you for watching.